Our guest speaker today is Nicholas Warr, Nick Warr, W-A-R-R, and he's traveled here today from California. Nick was a combat Marine during the Tet Offensive in the Battle of Hue and the effort to take over and to recapture the Imperial City, which was the cultural center for all Vietnam for centuries. The emperors lived there. And just before that battle during the Tet Offensive, that the North Vietnamese took it over, executed anywhere from 3,000 to 5,000 and more people. Many of them were buried alive. It was awful. Many were educators, doctors, and it was really the leading historic center of Vietnam. And there was a little foothold in the far back right corner where that the South Vietnamese Army had, and the Marines were able to come in. Nick was a second lieutenant Marine, platoon leader. He went in with a platoon of 58, and after 3 weeks of the most intense, most savage urban fighting since World War II, after the 3 weeks are over, out of his platoon of only 58, only 7 remained that weren't killed or wounded. Now, Nick had an important experience later in life, years after the war, the family matter won't get into, and it led him to be inspired to want to think of his men and to write a book about his experience. And he also found in doing all his work that a lot of the historical accounts of what went on there were false, including a New York Times bestseller, which was completely bogus, not surprising, another example of the long list of history of fake news of the New York Times. And he wrote a book to correct the record, and also the official military account was flawed, and that wasn't right. So he wrote the book, and he's an active member and has been for many years of the Vietnam Veterans for Factual History. If you look on our website, where we list the logos of our partners or resources, you'll see the Vietnam Veterans for Factual History logo there. So I just thought I'd give my 2 cents about what Nick is about, and I think I think we ought to all be gratified that he came this distance to tell us his story. Thank you.
Can you hear me? Okay, am I projecting into the back? Okay, great. First of all, Jim, thank you for that wonderful introduction. And John Butler and all of the AVVBA members, thank you for this great opportunity to come and talk with you today. Throughout my presentation, which I'm going to try to keep brief so that there is plenty of time for questions, because I think the learning occurs during those times. I'm going to be talking about my tour in Vietnam. I'm going to be talking about my books, and I'm going to be talking about what's coming down the road. Before I get started, I'd like to ask if we have any World War II veterans or Korean War veterans in the audience. If you are, please stand and be recognized. Korean, Vietnam, World War II. Thank you, sir, for your service. As you all probably know, a gentleman by the name of Tom Brokaw wrote a book a few years ago called The Greatest Generation, and that was focused on our World War II veterans. And certainly, because of the circumstances and the high risk that we faced during that conflict, I think the label is appropriate. But for those of you in the audience who are Vietnam veterans, I want to let you know that another very famous author and highly decorated combat veteran of the Vietnam War by the name of Jim Webb wrote an op-ed about a few years after that book came out, where he compared our generation of veterans favorably to the greatest generation. The stakes were different, the circumstances were different. In World War II, the nation was united, In our time, it became somewhat divided, but I think he has several good points. And all I want to say to you today is you are my brothers and sisters. Thank you for your service and welcome home. So, I was a college dropout in 1966, bored, working in a plywood mill in Eugene, Oregon. I've been working graveyard shift for over a year, and I was absolutely bored to tears, looking for something fun to do. I was in downtown Eugene, Oregon, when I saw one of my fellow workers from the plywood mill. I saw him for the first time in daylight, and I went, oh my heavens, I gotta go find something else to do. So about a block down the street was the US Navy or the Armed Forces recruiting station in Eugene, Oregon. And out in front was this wonderful, colorful poster of a naval aviator. He was standing tall, he's in front of his A6, he's got his flight suit on, he's got his helmet under his arm, and he's bigger than life. And I'm 20 years old, and I said, that looks like fun. So I go into the Navy recruiting office, greeted by a chief petty officer, and I said, how do I get that? He said, well, where did you graduate from college? I said, well, I got a couple of years, and he said, no. You have to have a degree to go to Naval Flight School, Pensacola. He said, but you know what? Go right next door and see the gunny, because he's got just the program for you. So I find myself in the U.S. Marine Corps recruiting office, this standing tall gunnery sergeant. And an hour later, I walked out of there having signed up for 4 years with the understanding that if I got through boot camp okay, I would be headed to Pensacola, Florida. I would be entering into what's called the MARCAD program, which stands for Marine Cadet. You learn how to fly the airplane, and when you get your wings, you get your commission. I said, that sounds like great. He gave me a 4-month delay, and I arrived in MCRD San Diego on June 6, 1966. As those of you in the audience today who are Marines know, all the stories about boot camp and OCS, they're true. It was an amazing experience to go from Nick Warr civilian to Nick Warr recruit. I decided that what I was going to do is keep my mouth shut and just try to obey orders. So it was 3 weeks before I got up the courage to ask my drill instructor, what do I have to do when I graduate from boot camp to get to MARCAD? And after he picked himself up off the floor laughing, he looked at me and said, why do you ask, recruit? And I said, because that's what my recruiter promised me. I'm going to MARCAD. I'm going to be a Marine aviator. And he said, well, I hate to tell you this, but MARCAD was a program, and it was canceled on June 6, 1966, the day I went aboard MCRD San Diego. Okay. In that instant, I knew I had no choice. I had seen what happened to young guys who didn't quite fit the mold, so I kept my nose clean, and I continued to march. About a week before boot camp graduation, my DI came to me. He said, hey, you've done well. Do you really want to fly around in airplanes? I said, yes, sir, that's why I joined this outfit. So he helped me get from a freshly minted Marine to Quantico, Virginia. I started OCS in January 1967, graduated from that in March, and then went to the basic school. About halfway through the basic school training, I had my final flight physical, and they determined that my sinuses have blockages because I played a lot of football and my nose had been broken many times. So I was instantly disqualified to be a Marine aviator. I then decided, since I had done well at the basic school, I had pretty high marks, I knew enough about the Marine Corps to make my decision when they said, what MOS do you want? I said, I want to be a supply officer. I want to be in the rear with the gear. I want to be surrounded by thousands of Marines in a combat base. Because here's the thing. My basic school class, which was 567, numbered 520 newly minted second lieutenants. Of that number, somewhere around 80% were going to be infantry officers, and they're going to get 30 days leave and go to Vietnam. So, my platoon commander at the time was a big guy named Jack Kelly. We called him Smilin' Jack, Captain Jack Kelly. Vietnam combat veteran, Silver Star, and we were out on a run one afternoon, and he ordered me to fall out and trail behind with him. And he basically said, okay, you've requested supply, you've got the marks, and if that's really what you want to do, I will give you supply. He said, but if you take supply, I got to give that guy infantry. And this is a guy who is actually a friend of mine, but it's one of those guys who had never should have joined the Marine Corps, okay, didn't quite fit. And you got friends in Vietnam, don't you? I said, yes, I do. And he says, he's going to go over there and get them killed. On the other hand, if you are interested in a career in my Marine Corps, I'll recommend you for a regular commission, but you got to choose infantry. He was a heck of a salesman, okay. So, fast forward. One thing happened between basic school and Vietnam to me, and that was I did not fail the Army Language Aptitude Test. Of those 520 second lieutenants, 12 of us didn't fail that test. Everybody else failed the test. They were not considered language friendly. So instead of going to Vietnam, we went to a 6-week high-intensity immersion training class on the Vietnamese language. By the end of those 6 weeks, we were blabbering at each other, and we could kind of understand each other. But what we didn't know was we were being taught the Hanoi dialect by a couple of Americans, a couple of Marine Staff Sergeants. So when I finally get to Vietnam, about 2 weeks before that, I read a copy of the Army-Navy Times in which they reported that week's casualties. 4 of my classmates were already dead. They had been in country for less than a month, 2 weeks. They were people that I knew, and they were people who I considered to be sound Marines and good leaders, and they're dead. So I began to doubt that the training I had received was sufficient to put me in a position to take command of any kind of a Marine unit without making a stupid mistake to get people hurt or killed. So when I arrived in the Republic of Vietnam, November 15, 1968, I took command of the 1st Platoon of Charlie Company 1-5, which had been under the command of a staff sergeant by the name of John Mother Mullen. He'd been running the platoon for 2 months. I took a chance. I went to him and I said, I'm a little concerned that maybe I need a finishing school, okay? So he took me under his arm, and every morning and every evening he'd brief me and debrief me. He would say, take off your bars, Lieutenant. You're going on patrol. Here's my rifle. You pay attention to that corporal because he's the squad leader. You pay attention to him. You keep your mouth shut and shoot if you need to. We did that for about a month, and at the end of the month, John said, okay, Lieutenant, you're ready. I think it was the best thing I ever did in my life. Smartest thing I did in combat was to listen to the wisdom and the experience of someone who knew the job. Promise you I'm going to talk a little bit about my books, very briefly. Right now I have 2 that are published. The first is Phase Line Green, The Battle for Hue, 1968. As Jim mentioned, that came about as the result of some self-therapy where I needed to get some things out. And I had been told, hey, write it, share it. and that's helpful, and that's proved to be true. In 1997, after 13 years of working on this book, okay, Naval Institute Press decided to publish the book. When they made the decision to publish the book, however, they needed someone to corroborate my story, because at that moment in time, my book about the battle for Hue City flew in the face of official Marine Corps history in many ways. So fortunately for me, I was able to reach my company commander at the time, who was on active duty with the FBI at the time, and he wrote a corroboration, which is actually in the end of my book, and they made the decision to publish it. Very quickly, the book got on the Marine reading list, which was formerly called the Commandant's Reading List, and it got in the hands of some very senior leaders in the Corps, both officers and enlisted men. As a matter of fact, it was required reading for 10 years by anybody, staff sergeant above, in the combat MOSs. So guys like General Jim Mattis and General Jim Conway read that book, and they studied it, and they applied the lessons to what they were facing in 2003 when they went from Kuwait to Baghdad. One of the biggest themes of this book is that, as you will learn when you read the book, and I'm going to touch on it a little bit tonight, or today, is that when you're going into a combat situation, your mission should be very clear, but the rules of engagement that you're enforced to live by need to be in balance with your unit's ability to accomplish your mission with minimal casualties. I add that last part. One of the interesting things I've learned about the Marine Corps since I've been doing lectures and seminars with various units over the past 20 years is they have adopted a set of leadership principles and traits. My favorite principle is deploy your command in accordance with its capabilities. So you should know, under a set of circumstances, what your unit can do and what they can't do. The story of the Vietnam War, and in particular this particular battle, the Battle for Hue 1968, was one of everyone was in a hurry. We just started throwing people into a situation, and we did not pay attention to that. Our leadership in the first phase of the Battle for Hue, which was the fighting in the New City, it was 6 days that those Marines had to fight under those circumstances. Their job was to attack and destroy the enemy forces holding the New City, but you can't hurt any of the buildings. No arty, no air, no naval gunfire, no direct fire weapons like the tank cannons and the Ontos. It is strictly prohibited. They lifted the rules on the sixth day of the fight because that battalion, those Marines, lost nearly 50% casualties, and they had made very little progress. So they lifted the rules, and in the next week, 2-5 and 1-1, made forward progress. It was still tough, it was still bloody, but they made forward progress, and they ended up, a unit of about 1,000, 1,200 Marines defeated the North Vietnamese Army in the New City, a force of about 5,000, using the Marine Air Ground Task Force approach to combat. I'm going to give you a little quick map orientation. This is I-Corps, and those of you who know the ground, just want to point out Chu Lai down on the coast. That's where 1-5 came aboard the Republic of Vietnam in late 1965. They then operated north and west out in the Quay Son Valley, a lot of big fights there. They spent time out in the An Hoa Basin. When I arrived in Vietnam, they were stationed at Hoi An, which is right there, which was VC. I mean, this is a major VC territory. snipers, booby traps, and they were pretty good at what they did. You might have 2 farmers with 1 rifle and 7 rounds, but they might have had a hand grenade, and they booby trap it, and you're on patrol, and the point man misses it, and boom, then they shoot those 6 rounds, 7 rounds, and run. You might have a bigger unit. It might be a command detonated bomb, but they always hit us and ran, and hit us and ran out in that area. They were really good at it, and what we didn't realize, in the summer of 1967, that pattern occurred over and over and over again. And eventually, the VC would bring us, by hitting and running, into a place where the enemy had the advantage. A battalion of hardcore VC or NVA waiting on good ground. And then large battles would take place. In every single case, even though often we took casualties at the beginning of those battles, we won those battles decisively because their advantage was they knew the ground. They also looked like our friends, the South Vietnamese, and oftentimes you couldn't tell the difference. But our advantage was our superiority in firepower. And also, I have to say, Marine determination. This went on right up until just before the Tet Offensive in 1968. The ground was gorgeous. Those of you who have spent any time in Vietnam know that was a tremendously beautiful country. If you could be outside the war damage. You know, I grew up in a small town in southern Oregon, green, everything is green. Vietnam, green, many, many wonderful different shades of green. And the scenery was spectacular. You guys know who that guy is, right? But you'd be walking through the bush and you would see these exotic things. This happens to be the Emperor's Palace outside the outskirts of the Citadel in Hue. And you would see things like this, which is ancient ruins of the Cham dynasty, who populated that part of Vietnam for about 9 or 10 centuries, ending at about 1500s. You'd run across these things, and it was amazing. It was distracting. You would stop being focused on what you were looking for, and then boom. So it was also very deadly. This is one of the places that was really deadly. This is the Hai Van Pass, north of Da Nang and south of Phu Bai. Who here has gone over the Hai Van Pass? Yeah, we called it the convoy killer. 1 out of every 3 convoys, and this is the only supply route between Da Nang and Phu Bai, were hit. Sometimes it was small, sometimes it was pretty bad. This is somebody's idea of a joke, but that's the Hai Van Pass. Moving north across the Hai Van Pass, somebody here asked me if I had been any time at Phu Loc. We did that. We moved to Phu Loc from Hoi An in late December of 1967. And when I arrived there, I happened to be reading Jules Roy's Battle for Dien Bien Phu, the French Indo-Chinese War. And I'm about halfway through the book, and I arrived at this location, and I went, holy cow, this is Dien Bien Phu all over again. Lots and lots of battles at this location. This is a close-up view from the air of what's called the Citadel. So Hue essentially was 2 cities in one. Everything south of the Perfume River was considered the new city. It was the heavily populated area with about 140,000 people at the time. The Citadel was the seat, the ancient seat of the Nguyen Dynasty emperors, and it's where the elites lived, educators, high government leaders, and so forth. And about 10,000 people lived inside that compound. So, very briefly, this is what happened. 2-5 and 1-1 fought on the south side of the river, and their battle came nearly to an end on about the 11th of February. And at that time, we were moving north to go through them and get inside the citadel. What's interesting is when the Tet Offensive broke out, only 2 places in this city were secured. The MACV compound on the south side of the river with a force of about 200 combined force, Army, Marines, and the 1st R Division compound, which is up in that upper right-hand corner. There are 10 entrances to this fortress. I'm going to show you a picture of what it looks like, but just know that the walls, the outside walls, are about 25 feet high, and they're about 90 feet thick. It's not a wall that you can easily take out with direct fire weapons, okay? It would take days and days to try to breach that. And had they not held that 10th gate, we would have had a hell of a time just getting in there to begin with. But we were able to pass through. We got on whiskey boats, LCUs, went downstream and snuck in the back door. That was the 12th of February, 1968. I want to talk just a little bit about what the city of Hue means to the Vietnamese people. As I've mentioned, it's the seat of the Nguyen Dynasty emperors. So for centuries, the entire Vietnamese people were ruled from this location by that group, by the emperor and his advisors. It's also the seat of the Vietnamese Buddhist religion. About 90% of Vietnamese people at that point in time were Buddhists. And if you remember the very disturbing image of a Buddhist monk immolating himself in Saigon early on to protest the war, that Buddhist monk lived just upstream from the citadel. That was his home base. It was also a center of commerce, and more importantly, it was a center of education. Vo Nguyen Gap went to university at the University of Hue. So this is not just important to the South Vietnamese people, it's important to all Vietnamese. To try to understand it as an American, combine the cities of Boston, New York, and Washington, D.C. That's what Hue means to the Vietnamese people. Now, one of the things that the North Vietnamese leadership did, that's on the south-facing wall. That's the entry to the Citadel Fortress and the Imperial Palace, which is a fortress within a fortress. So you can kind of see these are beautiful places. They're very sacred to the Vietnamese people, and you can kind of understand why they didn't want these buildings to be destroyed. Who would want to see the Washington Monument or the Lincoln Memorial in rubble? Yes, however, in my opinion, our leadership and the South Vietnamese leadership chose buildings over the lives of young Marines. Okay, so when we got inside the 1st Arvin Division compound, we were given our mission, which was to attack and destroy the enemy forces holding the citadel without destroying any of the buildings. Have you ever witnessed the mad moment? I mean, it's devastating when you do it right. But we had our hands tied behind our back. This is what happened.
Hue was considered one of the most beautiful cities in Asia. Divided by the perfume river, Hue was virtually 2 cities, one modern with wide avenues and 2- and 3-story European-style buildings. And north of the river, an ancient
Notice the guy with the AK-47? Improvise, adapt, use things that are available. So as you can see, our scenery went from living color to terrible black and white when we started fighting in a city, in people's houses. Very difficult to do. Part of our mission order was we couldn't blow up any of the buildings. We could use our small arms, our machine guns, and they did let us use the M79, the blooper. But that was it. I had a tank directly in support of my platoon on this day, the 13th of February, 1968. He refused to fire his cannon. He helped us with the 50 cal and the 30 cal. But when I got on his little, the phone on the back of the M48 and told him if he didn't start firing his cannon, I have a satchel charge and I'm going to blow you up, they just said, no, you're not, Lieutenant. We can't do this. That lasted for 3.5 days in the Citadel. During that first day, through a quirk of fate, my platoon, 1st Platoon Charlie Company, ended up on point. And throughout that day, we were the only attack element that tried to breach enemy forces across a street called Mai Tuc Luong that was dubbed Phase Line Green. So you kind of know now where the titles to my books come from. We did not survive the day intact. Jim, your numbers are a little exaggerated. I went in with 51 and came out with the 11, and most of them we lost on that very first day. When I reported the number 7, I had forgotten there was 4 other guys that had been working in the other platoon. But it was devastating. And at that point, I began to curse the day that I joined the Marine Corps and was a leader. Because here's the thing. I received my orders from company commander to platoon commander, and the platoon commanders are all going, this is nuts. Because we knew what had happened on the south side of the river, and we had seen those kind of things before. This is crazy. This does not conform to anybody's idea of military strategy and tactics. However, we're second lieutenants. All we can do is say, aye, aye, sir. But when I briefed my squad leaders, 3 junior enlisted men, I had 2 corporals and a lance corporal at that point in time, squad leaders, they looked at me like I was completely insane, and they were very verbal about the whole thing, okay? One of the things I've noticed over the years is that the generation that we call Vietnam veterans, let's face it, they bitched and they griped and they complained all the time, okay? Because they had to do the dirty work. Do the terms FUBAR and snafu come to mind? Okay, that's the reality of the situation. And I think a lot of people take those and interpret that as, oh, well, they hated the war and they wish they had never gone there and they're ashamed of their service. When in fact, the exact opposite is the case in most. Over the past 25 years, I have reached out and contacted and had conversations with hundreds and hundreds of Vietnam combat veterans. And what I hear from them is, yeah, it was really screwed up sometimes, but I'm proud that I served, and I would do it over again under the same circumstances if called. So when I began reading books that have recently come out and watching films where a majority of the combat veterans are saying, oh, we should have never gone there in the first place, it was unwinnable, these kinds of things, it just takes me by surprise. I completely don't understand it. So that's one of the reasons why I continue to write and continue to work on other avenues to hopefully someday make sure the American people really understand. They've been pretty generous to us over the last 20 years, not so nice in the first 30 years. The one thing that I'm proud of, because of our experience, our young men and women in uniform, when put into harm's way, when they come home, they're welcomed, they're applauded, okay? They're thanked for their service. A couple of pictures of what it looks like when you're fighting in a building. And this is the Dong Ba Tower after about 3 days of fighting. As you can see, it's really just a pile of rubble. This is what Phase Line Green looked like. I think this picture was taken on the 25th or 26th of February after the fighting in this segment of the city was over. This picture is taken from the Dong Ba Tower. It's not pretty. And this is a picture taken from outside the Citadel looking at the Dong Ba Tower. That was a picture that was taken a couple of years later after the battle when the South Vietnamese decided to move all the rubble and build a bunker on top of that. Pretty ugly, huh? But fortunately for all of us, this is what it looks like today. This place, the Citadel Fortress, was named a World Heritage Site, and the organization we know of as UNESCO is funding the Vietnamese government and continues to this day. And ultimately, the Citadel Fortress, the Imperial Palace, and every building that was there back in the day is going to be completely renovated and rebuilt. I like to put this picture up because it was taken about 60 pounds ago. That's me on the left, and the guy on the right with the non-mustache and the big smile is Scott Nelson, who was my company commander during this battle. Scott went on and served 27 years in the FBI, and he's still a close friend today. I wanted to point out one of your members who's here with me today, Robert Latimer. That's Robert right there with a big smile on his face. Robert, when I first met him, was a PSC and he was a squad leader. And he was a really good point man, a natural leader. And throughout the battle for Hue, even though he was badly wounded in late '67 and medevaced and took a while to heal, he came back. He had a choice. You want to go home? You want to go back to your buddies? There was no choice. He came back to the 1st Platoon and Charlie Company. So he was there when I joined him. This is another photo of Robert right there in the middle, getting ready to send out one of his patrols. I've always been very grateful, Robert. I'm going to talk a little bit about aftermath and outcomes of the book. First of all, several of us were invited to visit 1st Battalion 5th Marines in 1998 as a result of the publication of my book. Turns out at that moment, the 1st Battalion 5th Marines was going through major urban warfare training in expectation that if we do go to the Middle East, we're going to be fighting in cities. And those guys, one of the things about the Marine Corps and its leaders is they study the history. So the last time, this is in 1998, that any urban fighting had gone on was Hue. And before that was Seoul in 1950. I happened to be at Camp Pendleton for the 1st Marine Division anniversary. Me and my buddy, John Mother Mullen, who survived a terrible head wound, brought me to Camp Pendleton. Said, we're going to Camp Pendleton. And one of the events during that week was a combat operations demonstration where they put all the civilians up in the bleachers. They got enemy out there. They have a final protective force in a simulated perimeter, major bunkers and things of that nature. And at some point, I lost the thread. The thread broke on John, and I couldn't find him. So I asked somebody, he said, oh, he's down there in the bunker. This is a guy our age down inside one of those bunkers. And I go down there and I say, hey, John, he says, hey, this is Charlie Company. So this is our outfit doing this demonstration for us. It was really cool. So I get in the bunker. But these two guys come by. One's a colonel, one's a lieutenant colonel. They said, gentlemen, we got to get you in the bleachers because we're going to start. And John had prepared our meeting with hats that said, I survived Tet, Hue City, 1968. So we're standing there, and the taller one, the lieutenant colonel, said, oh, were you guys in Hue? I said, yes, sir. And I stuck out my hand. I said, I'm Nick Warr. He said, I'm reading your book right now. I said, well, that's great. Meet Mother Mullen. He looked at Mother and says, you're dead. Because when he was medevaced, we had no hope that he was going to survive that wound. But anyway, they invited us to come to Camp Pendleton for a day and to meet with the leadership of the 1st Battalion, 5th Marines. Talk about our experiences. Help them as they're going through this critical training to understand what to do and what not to do. And it turns out that in Operation Iraqi Freedom, which was the move from Kuwait to Baghdad, rules of engagement were such that, and this is a quote from General Jim Mattis, he said, if anyone starts shooting at my Marines from a mosque or a holy shrine or someone's house, that's an enemy defensive position. You take it out and you move on. And if anybody has any problems, you send them to me. That's the kind of leader that we had in Jim Mattis. Those rules of engagement stayed intact in 2004 during the battles of Fallujah I and Fallujah II. It wasn't pretty. There was a lot of damage done to that city, but it was a hotbed of the insurgency in Iraq. Since that time in the Middle East, often the rules are in balance. Sometimes, for whatever reason, they get out of balance. It's somewhat of a moving target. In addition to the white paper, okay, so I talked about that. I'm getting ahead of myself. What I'm working on right now is to finish my 3rd book, which will be the completion of a trilogy. Phase Line Green occurred right in the middle of the war. My 2nd book is called Charlie 1-5, a Marine Company's Vietnam War. Truly goes from 65 to early 68 and covers the major combat operations of the 1st Battalion, 5th Marines with testimony and stories from 30 combat veterans of that battalion. Very proud of that. Everybody from battalion commander to company commanders to private snuffy riflemen to sergeants to supporting arms guys. My 3rd book, which is about half done, and remember it takes me 13 years, so don't anybody get all anticipating, will continue the story post-Tet to the end of the war, which was March of '71. In addition to that, my angst today, standing before you as a Marine combat veteran of that war, is that when I read these new books and I see these films, the story is nearly, I don't understand what I'm reading and what I'm seeing. And so I have decided that for the rest of my life, I'll be doing everything I can to, if not set the record straight, then at least have information available to the American people that shows the other side. I'm working on a new documentary film. There will be no generals or colonels or senior enlisted guys. These stories come from the grunts. I do let the junior officers in a little bit, but most of them are the corporals and sergeants and riflemen who fought in Way. I'm narrowing the scope to include veterans who fought in Way City. I'm doing that intentionally because trying to do a documentary film that covers the entire scope of the war and be really, truly representative is a major challenge, even doing it just for Way City. Right now, we have recorded stories from 7 combat veterans. One was Alpha 11. First guy on that truck was 70 Marines, ran the gauntlet, reinforced MAC-V. Several are Charlie 15 guys. We will be in Charleston, South Carolina next weekend at the annual USS Way City Memorial Gathering. It's a memorial weekend. They roll out the red carpet, and it attracts a lot of Way City veterans for obvious reasons. And right now, we've got 15 more signed up to bear their testimony. This documentary film is in no way scripted. Those that we interview are simply asked to tell us who you are, tell us what your job was, and tell us about your experiences during the battle for Way City. And at the very end, I ask one question. After all these years, after what you've read and learned, look back on your time in Vietnam and just tell me how you feel about it. And so far, which I think is going to be accurate throughout, every one of them has said, well, you know, it was kind of screwy over here and we had a problem over there, but you know what? I'm damn proud that I served in the Marine Corps and I served in the Vietnam War. So the point is that what I want to do is I want to contribute to the other side so that these kinds of things are possibly not paid too much attention to.
In February 1968, the Communist Viet Cong launched nationwide attacks on more than 100 cities in South Vietnam. All of these attacks ended in disastrous military defeat for the Communists. On February 14, 1968, Walter Cronkite reported from Vietnam that the Tet Offensive was an overwhelming victory for America and South Vietnam.
First and simplest, the Viet Cong suffered a military defeat. Its missions proved suicidal. If they intended to stay in the cities as a negotiating point, they failed at that. The Vietnamese army reacted better than even its most ardent supporters had anticipated. There were no defections from its ranks, as the Viet Cong apparently had expected, and the people did not rise to support the Viet Cong as they also were believed to have expected.
Unfortunately, America never saw this broadcast, so they never knew that Tet was a major U.S. victory. Walter Cronkite then returned home, and on February 27, 1968, delivered the most famous broadcast of the Vietnam War, where he stated that the Tet Offensive was not a U.S. and South Vietnamese victory.
Tonight, back in more familiar surroundings in New York, we'd like to sum up our findings in Vietnam. Who won and who lost in the great Tet Offensive against the cities? I'm not sure. The Viet Cong did not win by a knockout, but neither did we. For it seems now more certain than ever that the bloody experience of Vietnam is to end in a stalemate. To say that we are mired in stalemate seems the only realistic, if unsatisfactory, conclusion. This is Walter Cronkite. Good night.
In his national broadcast to America, why did Cronkite
Before I open it up for questions, I just want to comment on what you just saw there. This film clip was found a couple of years back, digging through the CBS archives. Never had been seen. Nobody had ever known what Walter said on the 14th of February when he was in Vietnam had just come from Way. Obviously, something changed. My understanding is that his producer at CBS News felt that a different story needed to be told. So that's what happened. Most importantly, one person in our country who watched that second broadcast was the President of the United States. The President of the United States made the statement that if I've lost Walter, I've lost the country. And within a week, he made a major announcement to the American people saying that he did not seek nor did he want re-election for another term, that he was going to focus all his efforts on ending the war. So as you can see, the battle for Hue City had a major impact on the total outcome of the entire war. It was a major turning point. I do believe that the term and the concept of revisionism is important. As we move forward, we learn more. But I think revisionism needs to be focused properly and made sure that the revisions are based on fact, not someone's opinion. Okay, at this point, I'll take questions. Yes, in the back. Mark Moyer? Yes, he's part of the Vietnam Veterans for Factual History. He wanted me to, he asked me if I knew Mark Moyer. Mark Moyer is a historian. He is an academic. He wasn't a military guy. And he writes based on research and study. And his books are basically very supportive of what we did in the first place, and that had our leadership at the time adopted and embraced a sound military strategy in Vietnam, the outcome would likely have been much different. But unfortunately, in late 1965, the Joint Chiefs of Staff, we got boots on the ground. They're starting to throw more boots on the ground. The military, the Joint Chiefs of Staff, asked for a meeting with Johnson and McNamara in the White House. The result of that was they presented a set of recommendations to the President and the Secretary of Defense that were based on sound military strategy and tactics. The President rejected them, very rudely threw them out of the White House. And from that moment forward, Robert Strange McNamara took the lead and controlled the war for 4 years. His attrition warfare was ludicrous. We were more concerned with body counts than anything else. As most of us know, I mean, we can have a 10-to-1 kill ratio, which is what a lot of the leaders in the military wanted. But if you're not taking the ground and holding it, it's meaningless. How many times were there victories on mountains, and then you leave, and the enemy comes right back in? Yes, sir. Did you have a question? Okay. Questions? Yes, in the back.
How that was uncovered and the coverage that the press gave the American public on that massacre?
Sure. I can't speak for the media and their coverage, but I do know that somewhere between 3,000 and 5,000 of the elites living in Hue in that area were rounded up and systematically executed. This occurred starting right from the beginning when they took control and continued throughout those 2, 3, 4 weeks when the battles were going on. We know that as historical fact because within a month or two of the end of the battle, mass graves were uncovered in an area right outside Hue. So that was how they did it. They took control, they got rid of the dissidents, and then they moved on. It has been reported that somewhere between 3,000 and 5,000 South Vietnamese educators and leaders were put to death during that operation. You have a question right here.
If Congress had supported South Vietnam like the government had said they would, what do you think the outcome would have been? Would South Vietnam been able to survive the North Vietnamese and the Chinese if they had had weapons and material that we took away from them?
Sure, that's a great question, and my immediate answer is yes, I do believe so. There are some interesting chapters of the Vietnam War that are unknown to the American people. One of them is that the South Vietnamese, the Vietnamese Marine Corps, which was 2 regiments, at the time in April of 1975, were operating southwest of Saigon. The capital city's being overrun, everybody's getting out of Dodge. The president of South Vietnam got in touch by radio with the commanding general of the Vietnamese Marine Corps and said, hey, we've got ships offshore right now. Get yourself to the coastline. It's time to get out of here. And that Vietnamese Marine Corps general said, no, we're staying and we're fighting. For 2 years, from 1975 to 1977, that unit continued to fight with virtually nothing. Clothes on their back, they were running out of ammo, and in 1977, the general had to basically surrender because his men were dying, and most of them were put in those quote-unquote re-education camps, concentration camps, prisons. The general was put in there and stayed for 20 years. And it wasn't until Pete Peterson and a friend of mine, Ray Smith, pleaded to the American government to negotiate with the Vietnamese government to get those guys to the United States of America. I believe that, yes, there were instances, right, Robert, when the local forces were not necessarily 100% reliable, but for the most part, the ARVN units, the trained army, did fight respectfully. The expectation of the NVA coming south was 2 things. Number one, the ARVN soldiers are going to leave. They're going to desert in light of this onslaught. And the local population will rise and join our effort to drive the Americans into the South China Sea. Neither one of those things happened. And as the VVFH report states, they fought well during Operation Hue City. And in later years, anybody know about the Easter Offensive of 1972? We did not have boots on the ground. All the ground units were gone, but we were still supporting them with air power and also naval gunfire. The North Vietnamese Army in late March, early April, came across the DMZ. This time they didn't go around. They came straight across the DMZ in force, many divisions, and over 1,000 Soviet tanks. They did make progress. Thanks to one Marine captain, they were not able to make the progress fast enough to consolidate their positions. That captain is a legend in the Marine Corps, John Ripley, who single-handedly blew the Dong Ha Bridge under fire. If he had not done that, probably the war would have ended in 1972. But he did that, and the South Vietnamese forces were able to fight off this major offensive. Yes, sir.
About the South Vietnamese Marines.
Yes. There is a book and a film. The book was written by a friend of mine, Richard Botkin. He's a member of the VVFH. And I've forgotten the title of it, but it is the Easter Offensive, Ride the Thunder. It's called Ride the Thunder, and he made a movie out of it. And it does talk about... Back here. Yes.
I have 2 questions. One's brief, one's a little longer. I understood you to say earlier in your presentation that you got in country in November of '68. Did you mean '67?
Yes, I'm sorry.
Okay.
November 15th, 1967.
Okay. Well, the related question is, I got to Fubai with the 82nd, 3rd Brigade of the 82nd on the 1st of March, 68, at Camp Rodriguez, and of course there were large portions of the 101st at Camp Eagle, also at Fubai. I'm wondering what your contacts were in the Marine Corps with other services, with the Army or whomever, if you had any.
No, at my level, I'm a platoon commander. I'm down low on the food chain, okay? Those kinds of interactions usually came at the battalion level, sometimes at the company level, but at the battalion level. So no, I had very little contact with any of the other Army divisions who fought well in Vietnam, the Navy units and so forth.
There's another one back there.
Okay.
We have one last question, then we need to wrap up. You will be available afterwards for people to meet
I'm
with
going
you,
to
right?
stay here as long as anybody wants to talk to me, so we'll be
You have
back
one
there.
question?
Short comment, I have 4 copies of the DVD Ride the Thunder, which is a joint Vietnamese-American production
Yes.
that we thought would be sold in great numbers, but it sort of died out over things like Ken Burns and his expose. But anyway, if anyone needs that or would like to look at it, I can bring them in. I was thinking about donating them to our auction so you could win them, but
It's interesting that that book is 600 pages. I found one questionable thing in it. I called Rich. I said, hey, you said this, what? And he explained it to me. I went, okay, good. It was a different experience with the Bowden book.
John, I'd just like to see, how many of you in here were advisors to the South Vietnamese? Anybody?
Advisors.
Advisors?
Yep.
Okay, I was an advisor to the 2nd Battalion, 51st ARVN Regiment,
Yes.
which operated out of Hoi An.
Okay.
And we worked jointly with the Marines on a number of operations in the Quay Sun Valley and other scenic locations, let me put it that way. I can tell you, there was myself, another American captain, an Australian warrant officer, and an army sergeant, and 600 Vietnamese. And we, again, were their air support, their artillery support, their medical resupply, and whatever else, and sometimes we're fighting with them, whatever the objective. And I will tell you, that unit, the 51st ARVN Regiment, which was part of the 1st ARVN Division, was a damn fine unit.
Thank you.
All right, thank you all.
Thank you, John.
I owe you something. I don't have that.